The book signing. Carmody came up from the subway before dusk, and his eyeglasses fogged in the sudden cold. He lifted them off his nose, holding them while they cooled, and saw his own face smiling from a pale green leaflet taped to the wall. There he was in a 6-year-old photograph, and the words reading and book signing and the date and place. And he paused for a moment, shivering in the hard wind. The subway was his idea. The publisher could have sent him to Brooklyn in a limousine, but he wanted to go to the old neighborhood the way he always did. Long ago. He might, after all, never come this way again. The subway stairs seemed steeper than he remembered, and he felt twinges in his knees that he never felt in California. Sharp little needles of pain, like rumors of mortality. He didn't feel these pains after tennis, or even after speed walking along the Malibu roads. But the pain was there now, and was not eased by the weather. The wind was blowing fiercely from the harbor, which lay off in the darkness to his right, and he donned his glasses again and used both gloved hands to pull his brown fedora more securely to his brow. His watch told him that he had more than a half hour to get to the bookstore, just as he had hoped. He'd have some time for a visit, but not too much time. He crossed the street with his back to the place where the bookstore awaited him, and passed along the avenue where he once was young. His own aging face peered at him from the leaflets as he passed, some pasted on walls, others taped inside the windows of shops. In a way, he thought, they looked like wanted posters. He felt a sudden... What was the word? Not fear. Certainly not panic. Unease. That was the word. An uneasiness in the stomach. A flexing and then relaxing of muscles, an unwilled release of liquids or acids, all those secret wordless messages that in California were cured by the beach and the surf, or a quick hit of Malox. He told himself to stop. This was no drama. It was just a trip through a few streets where he had once lived but had not seen for decades. After 17 novels, this would be his first signing in the borough that had formed him. But the leaflets made clear that here, in this neighborhood, his appearance might be some kind of big deal. It might draw many people. And Carmody felt apprehensive, nervous, wormy with unease. "How does it feel going back to Brooklyn?" Charlie Rose had asked him the night before, in a small dark television studio on Park Avenue. "I don't know," Carmody said and chuckled. "I just hope they don't throw books at me, particularly my own books." And wanted to add, "I've never really left. Or to be more exact, those streets have never left me." Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The buildings themselves were as Carmody remembered them. They were old law tenements with fire escapes on the facades, but they seemed oddly comforting to Carmody. This was not one of those New York neighborhoods desolated by time and arson and decay. On the coast of California, he had seen photographs of the enrubbled lots of Brownsville and East New York. There were no lots here in the old neighborhood. If anything, the buildings looked better now, with fresh paint and clear glass on the street-level doors, instead of hammered tin-painted gray. He knew from reading the New York Times that the neighborhood had been gentrified, that most of the old families had moved away, to be replaced by younger people who paid higher rents. There was some unhappiness to all of that, the paper said, but still, the place looked better. As a boy, he had walked these streets many times on nights like this, when most people retreated swiftly from the bitter cold to the uncertain warmth of the flats. nights of piled snow and stranded streetcars. Now he noticed lights coming on in many of those old apartments, and shadows moving like ghosts behind drawn shades and curtains. He peered down a street toward the harbor, noticed some stubborn scabs of old snow, black between parked cars, and in the distance saw a thin scarlet band where the sun was setting in New Jersey. On this high slope, the harbor wind turned old snow into iron, but the sliver of sun was the same too. The day was dying. It would soon be night. If the buildings were the same, the shops along the avenue were all different. Fitzgerald's bar was gone, where his father did most of his drinking, and so was Sussman's hardware and Fichetti's fruit and vegetable and the Freedom Meat store and the pharmacy. What was the name of that drugstore? Right there, on that corner. An art supply store now. An art supply store. Molof's. The drugstore was called Molof's, and next door was a bakery. Our Own, they called it. And now there was a computer store where a TV repair shop once stood, and a dry cleaner's where men once stood at the bar of Radigan's, singing the old songs. All gone. Even the old clock factory had been converted into a condominium. None of this surprised Carmody. He knew they'd all be gone. Nothing lasts. Marriages don't last. Ball clubs don't last. Why should shops last? Wasn't that the point of each one of his 17 books? The critics never saw that point, but he didn't care. Those novels were not literature, even to Carmody. He would say in interviews that he wrote for readers, not for critics, and said to himself, "I'm not Stendhal or Hemingway or Faulkner." He knew that from the beginning. Those novels were the work he did after turning 40, when he reached the age limit for screenwriting. He worked at the top of his talent, to be sure, and used his knowledge of movies to create plots that kept readers turning the pages. But he knew they were commercial products, novels about industries and how they worked, his characters woven from gossip and profiles in Fortune or Business Week. He had started with the automobile industry, and then moved to the television industry and the sugar industry and the weapons industry. In each of them, the old was destroyed by the new. The old ruling families decayed and collapsed, and newer, more ruthless men and women took their places. The new one was about the food industry, from the farms of California to the dinner plates of New York and Los Angeles. Like the others, it had no aspirations to be seen as art. That would be pretentious. But they were good examples of craft, as honest as well-made chairs. In each of them, he knew, research served as a substitute for imagination and art and memory. 3 different researchers had filed memos on this last one, the new one, the novel he would sign here tonight, in the Barnes & Noble store 5 blocks behind him. He hoped nobody in the audience would ask why he had never once written about Brooklyn. To be sure, he had never denied his origins. There was a profile in People magazine in 1984, when his novel about the gambling industry went to #1 on the New York Times bestseller list and stayed there for 17 weeks. He was photographed on the terrace of the house in Malibu with the Pacific stretched out beyond him, and they used an old high school newspaper photograph showing him in pegged pants and a t-shirt, looking like an apprentice gangster or some variation on the persona of James Dean. The article mentioned his 2 ex-wives. There was now a 3rd woman receiving his alimony checks. But the reporter was also from Brooklyn, and was more intrigued by the Brooklyn mug who had become a best-selling author. "You went west in 1957, the reporter said, "just like the Dodgers. When they left, I left too. Because that was the end of Brooklyn as I knew it, Carmody said. I figured I'd have my revenge on Los Angeles by forcing it to pay me a decent living. That was a lie, of course. One among many. He didn't leave Brooklyn because of the Dodgers. He left because of Molly Mulrain. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Now he was standing across the street from the building where both of them had lived. The entrance then was between a meat market and a fruit store, converted now into a toy store and a cell phone shop. Molly lived on the first floor left, Carmody on the top floor right. She was 3 years younger than Carmody, and he didn't pay her much attention until he returned from the army in 1954. An old story. She had blossomed, and one thing had led to another. He remembered her father's rough, unhappy, threatening face when he first came calling to take her to the movies. Patty Mulrain, the cop. And the way he looked when he went out in his police uniform for a 4 to 12 shift, his gun on his hip, his usual slouch shifting as he walked taller and assumed a kind of swagger. And how appalled Patty Mulrain was when Carmody told him he was using the GI Bill to become a writer. A writer? What the hell is that? I'm a writer too. I write tickets, haha. A writer. How do you make a living with that? What about being a lawyer, a doctor? What about, what do they call it now, criminology? At least you'd have a shot at becoming a lieutenant. The father liked his Fleischmann's and beer and used the Dodgers as a substitute for conversation. The mother was a dim, shadowy woman who did very little talking. Molly was the youngest of the 3 children, and the only one still at home that summer. Her brother Frankie was a fireman and lived with his wife in Bay Ridge. There was another brother. What was his name? Shawnee. Flat face, hooded eyes, a hard tank-like body. Carmody didn't remember much about him. There had been some kind of trouble, something about a robbery, which meant he could never follow his father into the police department. And Shawnee had moved to Florida, where he was said to be a fisherman in the Keys. Every Sunday morning, father, mother, and daughter went to Mass together. Now, on this frozen night decades later, Carmody's unease rushed back. Ah, Molly, my Molly-o. The fire escapes still climbed 3 stories to the top floor where the Carmodys lived. But the building looked better, like all the others on the avenue. On the top floor right on this frozen night, the shades were up and Carmody could see ochre-colored walls and a warm light cast by table lamps. This startled him. In memory, the Carmody flat was always cold, the windows rimmed with frost in winter, he and his sisters making drawings with their fingernails in the cold bluish light cast from a fluorescent ceiling lamp. His father was cold too, a withdrawn, bitter man who resented the world and the youth of his children. His mother was a drinker, and her own chilly remorse was relieved only by occasional bursts of rage. They nodded or grunted when Carmody told them about his ambitions, and his mother once said in a slurred voice, "Who do you think you are, anyway?" One Saturday afternoon in the Mulrain flat, he and Molly were alone. Her parents gone off to see Frankie and his small child. Molly proudly showed him her father's winter uniform, encased in plastic from Kent's dry cleaners, and the medals he had won, and the extra gun, a nickel-plated .38 caliber Smith & Wesson, oiled and ready in a felt box. She talked to him about a book she was reading by A.J. Cronin, and he told her she should read F. Scott Fitzgerald. She made him a ham and Swiss cheese sandwich for lunch. They sipped tea with milk, thick with sugar. And then, for the first time, they went to bed together in her tiny room with its window leading to the fire escape. She was in an agony, murmuring prayers, her hands and arms moving in a jittery way to cover breasts and hair, trembling with fear and desire. "Hold me tight," she whispered. "Don't ever leave me." He had never written any of that, or how at the end of his first year of college, at the same time that she graduated from St. Joseph's, he rented the room near New York University to get away from his parents and hers, and how she would come to him after work as a file clerk at Metropolitan Life, and they would vanish into each other. He still went back to Brooklyn. He still visited the ice house of his parents. He still called formally in the Mulrain apartment to take Molly to the Sanders or the RKO Prospect. He was learning how to perform. But the tiny room had become their place, their gangster's hideout, the secret place to which they went for sin. Now on this frozen night he stared at the dark windows of the first floor left, wondering who lived there now, and whether Molly's bones were lying in some frozen piece of the Brooklyn earth. He could still hear her voice, trembling and tentative. "We're sinners, aren't we?" He could hear her saying, "What's to become of us?" He could hear the common sense in her words and the curl of Brooklyn in her accent. "Where are we going?" she said. "Please don't ever leave me." He could see the mole inside her left thigh. He could see the fine hair at the top of her neck. "Well, will you look at this?" a hoarse male voice said from behind him. "If it ain't Buddy Carmody." Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Carmody turned and saw a burly man smoking a cigarette in the doorway of a tenement. He was wearing a thick ski jacket and jeans, but his head was bare. The face was not clear in the obscure light, but the voice told Carmody it was definitely someone from back then. Nobody had called him Buddy in 46 years. "How are ya?" Carmody said, peering at the man as he stepped out of the doorway. The man's face was puffy and seamed, and Carmody tried to peel away the flesh to see who had lived in it when they both were young. "Couldn't stay away from the old neighborhood, could you, Buddy?" The unease was seething, but now Carmody felt a small stream of fear make its move in his stomach. "It's been a long time," Carmody said. "Remind me, what's your name?" "You shittin' me, Buddy? How could you forget my name?" "I told you, man, it's been a long time." "Yeah, it's easy to forget for some people. Advanced age and all that," Carmody said, performing a grin, glancing to his left, to the darkening shop windows, the empty street, imagining himself running. "But not everybody forgets," the man said. He flipped his cigarette under a parked car. "My sister didn't forget." Oh God. "You must be Shawnee," Carmody said quietly. "Am I right? Shawnee Mulrain? Ah, you remembered. How are you, Shawnee?" He could see Shawnee's hooded eyes now, so like the eyes of his policeman father, still, unimpressed. He moved close enough so that Carmody could smell the whiskey on his breath. "How am I?" "Huh? How am I?" "Not as good as you, buddy boy. We keep up, you know. The books, that miniseries or whatever it was on NBC. Pretty good you're doing." Carmody stepped back a foot as subtly as possible, trying to decide how to leave. He wished a police car would turn the corner. He trembled, feeling a black wind of negation pushing at him, backing him up, a small focused wind that seemed to come from the furrowed brow of Shawnee Mulrain. He tried to look casual, turned and glanced at the building where he was young, at the dark first floor left, the warm top floor right. "She never got over you, you prick." Carmody shrugged. "It's a long time ago, Shawnee," he said, trying to avoid being dismissive. "I remember that first month after you split. Shawnee said. She cried all the time. She cried all day. She cried all night. She quit her job 'cause she couldn't do it and cry at the same time. She'd start to eat, then oof, she'd break up again. A million fucking tears, buddy. I seen it. I was there just back from the Keys, and my father wanted to find you and put a bullet in your head. And Molly, poor Molly. You broke her fucking heart, buddy. Carmody said nothing. Other emotions were flowing now. Little rivers of regret, remorse, unforgivable mistakes. His stomach rose and fell and rose again. And that first month? Hey, that was just the start. The end of the second month after you cut out, she tells my mother she's knocked up. No. Yes. I didn't know that, Shawnee, I swear. Don't lie, buddy. My old man told your old man. He pulled a gun on him for Christ's sakes, trying to find out where you was. I never heard any of this. Don't lie, buddy. You lie for a livin', right? All those books, they're lies, ain't they? Don't lie to me. I didn't know, Shawnee. Tell the truth, you ran because she was pregnant. No, that wasn't why. He truly didn't know. He glanced at his watch. 10 minutes until the book signing. He felt an ache rising in his back. She had the baby, someplace in New Jersey, Shawnee said. Catholic nuns or something, and gave it up. A boy it was, a son. Then she came home and went in her room. She went to Mass every morning, I guess praying to God to forgive her. But she never went to another movie with a guy, never went on a date. She stood in her room like another goddamned nun. She saw my mother die and buried her, and saw my father die and buried him, and saw me get married and move here with my Mary, right across the street to live upstairs. I'd come see her every day and try talking to her, but it was like, you want tea, Shawnee, or coffee? Shawnee moved slightly, placing his bulk between Carmody and the path to Barnes & Noble. Once I said to her, how about you come with me and Mary to Florida? You like it. We could all move there. It's beautiful, I said to her. Palm trees and the ocean. You'd love it. Figuring I had to get her out of that fucking room. She looked at me like I said, hey, let's move to Mars. Shawnee paused, trembling with anger and memory, and lit another cigarette. Just once she talked a blue streak, drinking gin, I guess it was, and said to me real mad, I don't want to see anyone, you understand me, Shawnee? I don't want to see people holding hands. I don't want to see little boys playing ball, you understand me? He took a deep drag on the camel. I want to be here, she says to me, when Buddy comes back. Carmody stared at the sidewalk, at Shawnee's scuffed black shoes, and heard her voice. When Buddy comes back, saw the fine hair at the top of her neck, thinking, here I am, I'm back. So she waited for you, Buddy. Year after year in that dark goddamned flat. Everything was like it was when you split. My mother's room, my father's room, her room. All the same clothes. It wasn't right what you done to her, Buddy. She was a beautiful girl. That she was. And a sweet girl. Yes, it wasn't right. You had the sweet life and she should have had it with you. Carmody turned. And when did she die? She didn't die, Buddy. She's still there, right across the street. Waiting for you, you prick. Asterisk, 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 Carmody turned then, lurching toward the corner, heading to the bookstore. He did not run, but his legs carried him in flight, thinking, she's alive. Molly Mulrain is alive. He was certain she had gone off, married someone, A cop, or a fireman, or a car salesman had settled in the safety of Bay Ridge or some far-off green suburb, a place without memory, without ghosts. He was certain that she had lived a long while, married, had children, and then died, the way everybody did. And now he knew the only child she ever had was his, a son, and he was in flight, afraid to look back. He could sense the feral pack behind him, filling the silent streets with howls. He had heard them often in the past few years, on beaches at dusk in too many dreams. The voices of women, wordless but full of accusation, wives and girlfriends, and one-night stands in college towns. Women his own age and women not yet women. Women discarded, women used, women injured, coming after him on a foggy moor from groves of leafless trees, their eyes yellow, their clothing mere patchy rags. If they could speak, the words would be about lies, treacheries, theft, broken vows. He could see many of their faces as he moved, remembering some of their names, and knew that in front, leading the pack, was Molly Mulrain. Crossing a street, he slipped on a ridge of black ice and banged against the hood of a parked car. Then he looked back. Nobody was there. He paused, breathing hard and deep. Not even Shawnee had come after him, and now the book signing filled him with another kind of fear. Who else might come there tonight, knowing the truth? Hauling up the ashes of the past? What other sin would someone dredge up? Who else might come for an accounting? He hurried on, the feral visions erased. He was breathing heavily, as he always did when waking from bad dreams. A taxi cruised along the avenue, its rooftop light on, as if pleading for a fare to Manhattan. Carmody thought, I could just go. Just jump in this cab. Call the store. Plead sudden illness. Just go. But someone was sure to call Rush and Malloy at the Daily News or Page 6 at the Post and report the no-show. Brooklyn boy calls it in. All that shit. No. And then a rosy-cheeked woman was smiling at him, the manager of the bookstore. Oh, Mr. Carmody, we thought you got lost. Not in this neighborhood, he said, and smiled as required by the performance. You've got a great crowd waiting. Let's do it. We have water on the lectern and lots of pens, everything you need. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. As they climbed to the second floor, Carmody took off his hat and gloves and overcoat, and the manager passed them to an assistant. He glanced at himself in a mirror, at his tweed jacket and black crew-collared sweater. He looked like a writer, all right. Not a cop or a fireman or even a professor. A writer. He saw an area with about 100 people sitting on folding chairs, penned in by walls of books, and more people in the aisles beyond the shelves, and another large group standing at the rear. Yes, a great crowd. He stood modestly beside the lectern as he was introduced by the manager. He heard the words, one of Brooklyn's own, and they sounded strange. He didn't often think of himself that way, and in signings all over the country that fact was seldom mentioned. This store itself was a sign of a different Brooklyn. Nothing stays the same. Everything changes. There were no bookstores in his Brooklyn. He found his first books in the public library branch near where he lived, or in the great main branch at Grand Army Plaza. On rainy summer days, he spent hours among their stacks. But the bookstores, where you could buy and own a book, they were down on Pearl Street under the L, or across the river on 4th Avenue. His mind flashed on Bomba the Jungle Boy at the Giant Cataract, the first book he'd ever finished. How old was I? 11. Yes, 11. It cost a nickel on Pearl Street. That year, I had no bad dreams. During the introduction, he peered out at the faces, examining them for hostility. But the faces were different too. Most were in their 30s, lean and intense, or prepared to be critical, or wearing the competitive masks of apprentice writers. He had seen such faces in 1,000 other bookstores, out in America. About a dozen African Americans were scattered through the seats, with a few standing on the sides. He saw a few paunchy men with 6 or 7 copies of his books, collectors looking for autographs to sell on eBay or some fan website. He didn't see any of the older faces, those faces still marked by Galway or Sicily or the Ukraine. He didn't see the pouchy, hooded masks that were worn by men like Shawnee Mulrain. His new novel and 5 of the older paperbacks were stacked on a table to the left of the lectern, ready for signing, and Carmody began to relax. Thinking, it's another signing. Thinking, I could be in Denver or Houston or Berkeley. Finally, he began to read, removing his glasses because he was nearsighted, focusing on words printed on pages. His words, his pages. He read from the first chapter, which was always fashioned as a hook. He described his hero being drawn into the mysteries of a grand Manhattan restaurant by an old college pal, who was one of the owners, all the while glancing up at the crowd so that he didn't sound like Professor Carmody. The manager was right. It was a great crowd. They listened. They laughed at the hero's wisecracks. Carmody enjoyed the feedback. He enjoyed the applause, too, when he had finished. And then he was done, the hook cast. The manager explained that Carmody would take some questions and then sign books. He felt himself tense again, and thought, why did I run all those years ago? Why did I do what I did to Molly Mulrain? I ran to escape, he thought. That's why everybody runs. That's why women run from men. Women have run from me too. To escape. People moved in the folding chairs, but Carmody was still. I ran because I felt a rope tightening on my life. Because Molly Mulrain was too nice, too ordinary, too safe. I ran because she gave me no choice. She had a script and I didn't. They would get engaged and he'd get his BA and maybe a teaching job, and they'd get married and have kids and maybe move out to Long Island or over to Jersey, and then I ran because I wanted something else. I wanted to be Hemingway in Pamplona or in a cafe on the left bank. I wanted to make a lot of money in the movies, the way Faulkner did or Irwin Shaw, and then retreat to Italy or the south of France. I wanted risk. I didn't want safety. So I ran. Like a heartless, frightened prick. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The first question came from a bearded man in his 40s, the type who wrote nasty book reviews that guaranteed him tenure. Do you think if you'd stayed in Brooklyn? The bearded man asked. You'd have been a better writer? Carmody smiled at the implied insult, the patronizing tone. Probably, he answered. But you never know these things with any certainty. I might never have become a writer at all. There's nothing in the Brooklyn air or the Brooklyn water that makes writers, or we'd have a couple of million writers here. A woman in her 20s stood up. Do you write on a word processor, in longhand, or on a typewriter? This was the way it was everywhere, and Carmody relaxed into the familiar. Soon he'd be asked how to get an agent or how he got his ideas, and how do I protect my own ideas when I send a manuscript around? Could you read the manuscript of my novel and tell me what's wrong? The questions came, and he answered as politely as possible. He drew people like that, and he knew why. He was a success, and there were thousands of would-be writers who thought there were secret arrangements, private keys, special codes that would open the doors to the alpine slopes of the bestseller lists. He tried to tell them that, like life, it was all a lottery. Most didn't believe him. Then the manager stepped to the microphone and smiled and said that Mr. Carmody would now be signing books. Because of the large turnout, the manager said, Mr. Carmody will not be able to personalize each book. Otherwise, many of you would have a long wait. Carmody thanked everybody for coming on such a frigid night, and there was warm, loud applause. He sat down at the table and sipped from a bottle of Poland spring water. He signed the first 3 books on the frontispiece, and then a woman named Peggy Williams smiled and said, "Could you make an exception? We didn't go to school together, but we went to the same school 20 years apart. Could you mention that?" He did, and the line slowed. Someone wanted him to mention the Dodgers. Another, Coney Island. One man wanted a stickball reference, although he was too young to ever have played that summer game. "It's for my father," he explained. There was affection in these people for this place, this neighborhood, which was now their neighborhood. But Carmody began to feel something else in the room, something he could not see. "You must think you're hot shit," said a woman in her 50s. She had daubed rouge on her pale cheeks. "I've been in this line almost an hour." "I'm sorry," he said and tried to be light. "It's almost as bad as the Department of Motor Vehicles." She didn't laugh. "You could just sign the books," she said. "Leave off the fancy stuff." "That's what some people want," he said. "The fancy stuff. And you gotta give it to them? Come on." He signed his name on the title page and handed it to her, still smiling. "Wait a minute," she said, holding the book before him like a summons. "I waited a long time. Put in, for Jerry, with a G, who waited online for more than an hour." She laughed then too, and he did what she asked. The next 3 just wanted signatures, and 2 just wanted Merry Christmas, and then a collector arrived, and Carmody signed 6 first editions. He was weary now, his mind filling with images of Molly Mulrain and Shawnee's face and injuries he had caused so long ago. All out there somewhere. And still the line trailed away from the table into a crowd that, without his glasses, had become a multicolored smear, like a bookcase. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The woman came around from the side aisle, easing toward the front of the line in a distracted way. Carmody saw her whisper to someone on the line, a young man who made room for her with the deference reserved for the old. She was hatless, her white hair cut in girlish bangs across her furrowed brow. She was wearing a short down coat, black skirt, black stockings, mannish shoes. The coat was open, showing a dark rose sweater. Her eyes were pale. Holy God! She was 6 feet away from him, behind 2 young men and a collector. A worn leather bag hung from her shoulder, a bag so old that Carmody remembered buying it in a shop in the village, next door to the 8th Street bookshop. He remembered it when it was new, and so was he. He glanced past the others and saw that she was not looking at him. She stared at bookshelves or the ceiling or the floor. Her face had an indoor whiteness, the color of ghosts. He signed a book, then another. And the girl he once loved began to come to him, the sweet, pretty girl who asked nothing of him except that he love her back. And he felt then a great rush of sorrow, for her, for himself. for their lost child. He felt as if tears would soon leak from every pore in his body. He heard a whisper of someone howling. The books in front of him were now as meaningless as bricks. Then she was there, and Carmody rose slowly and leaned forward to embrace her across the table. "Oh, Molly," he whispered. "Oh, Molly, I'm so sorry." She smiled then, and the brackets that framed her mouth seemed to vanish. And for a moment Carmody imagined taking her away with him, repairing her in the sun of California, making it up, writing a new ending, rewriting his own life. He started to come around the table. "Molly," he said. "Molly, my love." Then her hand reached into the leather bag, and he knew what it now must hold. Passed down from her father. A souvenir of long ago. Yes, he thought. Release me, Molly. Yes. Bring me your nickel-plated gift. Do it. Her hand came out of the bag, holding what he expected.